The walls were listening, and by the time anyone realized it, their secrets had already sealed their fate. Providence, Rhode Island, November 1891. The city hummed with the electric promise of progress, even as gas lamps still flickered in the gathering dusk. Steel mills clanged their industrial symphony along the riverbanks, their smokestacks painting the autumn sky in shades of gray and amber. Textile factories churned out fortunes as surely as they churned out cotton, and the old money families clutched their pearls as new wealth stormed through the gates of high society, like an invading army armed with banknotes instead of bayonets. The air smelled of coal smoke, salt water from Narragansett Bay, and the peculiar mixture of ambition and desperation that defined the American experiment in its most rapacious hour. Among the newly rich stood Edgar Vandermeer, a rail baron whose fortune had been built on cross-country expansion, government contracts secured through methods no one examined too closely, and a talent for knowing exactly which palms needed greasing and which spines needed stiffening. His reputation had been carefully constructed on calculated charm, strategic philanthropy, and an uncanny ability to always be 3 steps ahead of his competitors. His mansion on Benefit Street rose above the city like a crown, its limestone facade gleaming white against the perpetual fog that rolled in from the bay, 4 stories of Beaux-Arts excess that announced to everyone who saw it, Edgar Vandermeer had arrived, and he intended to stay. Before continuing, check right now if already this Increto on the channel, and tell me in the comments where is accompanying us. I want to see if there's someone from my city here. But Edgar Vandermeer had not built his empire on charm alone. He had built it on secrets. Secrets whispered in dark corners, secrets traded like currency, secrets that could elevate a man to power or dash him against the rocks of public scandal. And his mansion, that gleaming monument to the Gilded Age, was not merely a home. It was a machine. A carefully engineered instrument designed for one singular purpose, to capture every secret that crossed its threshold. The November rain hammered against the carriage windows with the persistence of an unwanted creditor as Catherine Ashford pressed her gloved hand against the cold glass, watching the Vandermeer mansion materialize through the sheets of water like a ship emerging from fog. At 28, she had already buried 1 husband, survived a scandal that would have destroyed a lesser woman, and learned through bitter experience that survival in Providence society required more than good breeding and a pleasant face. It required information. It required knowing who owed whom, who hated whom, who was sleeping with whom. It required treating every conversation as a negotiation and every smile as a weapon. Her husband, Richard Ashford, had been a banker with expensive tastes and poor judgment. He'd gambled away most of their money on bad investments and worse poker hands before putting a pistol in his mouth one humid August evening. Catherine had found him in his study, slumped over his mahogany desk, blood pooling on the ledgers that documented his failures. The scandal had been immediate and merciless. Whispers followed her everywhere. Poor Catherine, so young to be a widow. But had she driven him to it? Surely she must have known about his debts. Perhaps she'd even encouraged his recklessness, hoping to inherit what little remained. She'd learned quickly that sympathy was a finite resource in high society, exhausted within weeks. But information never depreciated. Information could be parlayed into favor, into protection, into survival itself. So Catherine had reinvented herself as a woman who knew things, who could be counted on to remember who had been seen with whom at which gathering, who could discreetly mention that a certain gentleman's business was on shaky ground, or that a certain lady's daughter was perhaps too friendly with the stable boy. It was this reputation that had earned her the invitation to Edgar Vandermeer's autumn gala, and it was this reputation that made her dangerous. "You're certain he'll be here tonight?" Catherine asked, not turning from the window where raindrops raced each other down the glass like tears. Her companion, a sharp-featured woman named Margaret Sinclair, adjusted the ostrich feathers in her elaborate coiffure, which had been constructed that afternoon by a French lady's maid at considerable expense. Margaret was 42, never married, and possessed a fortune inherited from a father who'd made his money in whaling before that industry started its long, slow decline. She spent her days managing charitable organizations and her evenings collecting gossip with the dedication of a museum curator. "Harrison Blackwell attends every Vandermeer gathering," Margaret replied, her voice carrying the faint trace of a Boston accent she'd never quite managed to erase, despite decades in Providence. "The man thinks he's untouchable since his shipping company secured those government contracts. Military supplies to Fort Adams, I hear. Blankets and salt pork and God knows what else. The profit margins must be extraordinary. No one is untouchable," Catherine murmured, watching the mansion grow larger as they approached. "Everyone has something to hide. Everyone has done something they'd rather the world didn't know about. The trick is finding out what it is before they find out what you've done." Margaret gave her a sidelong glance. "You've become rather cynical, my dear." "I've become rather realistic. There's a difference." The carriage rolled to a stop beneath the mansion's porte-cochere, and liveried footmen descended with umbrellas like a choreographed ballet, their movements precise and practiced. Catherine stepped out into the November cold, her emerald gown immediately soaked at the hem despite their best efforts. The fabric clung to her legs, heavy with water. The mansion loomed above her, 4 stories of Beaux-Arts architecture that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Gargoyles perched along the roofline, their stone mouths open in silent screams, water streaming from their eyes like tears of grief for sins not yet committed. The massive front doors were carved from oak and reinforced with iron bands that looked like they could withstand a siege. They swung open as Catherine approached, revealing a butler so tall and gaunt he might have been assembled from spare parts scavenged from a mortuary. His face held all the warmth and expression of the gargoyles above. "Mrs. Ashford, Mrs. Sinclair, welcome," the butler intoned, his voice carrying the hollow resonance of a man speaking from the bottom of a well. "Mr. Vandermeer will receive guests in the Grand Salon. May I take your coats?" The entry hall stole Catherine's breath, not with beauty but with overwhelming, almost oppressive opulence. It was the kind of wealth that didn't whisper but shouted, that didn't suggest prosperity but demanded acknowledgement of power. Marble columns rose to a frescoed ceiling where gilt-winged angels danced among clouds painted in shades of cerulean and cream. Twin staircases curved upward like embracing arms, their banisters carved from mahogany shipped from the Philippines at God only knew what expense. Crystal chandeliers hung from bronze chains, so massive they could have moored ships, each one containing enough candles to light a small village for a week. The floor was Italian marble, black and white arranged in a dizzying geometric pattern that seemed to shift and move if you stared at it too long. The air smelled of expensive cigars imported from Cuba, French perfume that cost more per ounce than most workers earned in a month, and something else Catherine couldn't quite identify. Something metallic and cold, like the inside of a bank vault. Like the smell of money, if money had a smell beyond ink and paper. They followed the butler through corridors lined with oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors who probably weren't Vandermeer's actual relatives at all. New money always tried to buy old legitimacy, commissioning portraits of noble-looking strangers and claiming them as great-grandfathers. Catherine studied the walls as they walked, noting details that seemed slightly off. The walls were unusually thick, she realized. The sounds of the gathering party ahead should have been louder, clearer. Instead, they seemed dampened, swallowed by something more than just expensive wallpaper and heavy drapes. The Grand Salon glittered with Providence's elite and those who aspired to join their ranks. Women dripped with diamonds that caught the chandelier light and threw rainbows across the Persian carpets, their necks and wrists and ears decorated with fortunes that could have fed entire neighborhoods. Men clustered in tight groups, their conversations a low rumble of stock prices, political maneuvers, and carefully veiled threats disguised as business proposals. A string quartet played Vivaldi in the corner with professional competence, though no one seemed to be listening. The music was simply another expensive accessory, like the champagne or the imported flowers or the liveried servants who glided between the guests like ghosts. Edgar Vandermeer stood near the fireplace, holding court like a king among courtiers. He was handsome in the way powerful men often are, not through any particular beauty of feature, but through the confidence that comes from knowing you can destroy anyone in the room with a word or a signature. His dark hair was slicked back with pomade that smelled of bergamot and something spicy. His evening coat was cut from English wool, his waistcoat embroidered with silver thread, his cravat pinned with a diamond the size of a robin's egg. His smile was practiced and empty, reaching his lips but never quite making it to his eyes, which were the cold grey colour of January rain. "Catherine Ashford," he said, his voice carrying across the room despite the din, cutting through conversations like a knife through butter. "You honour my home with your presence, Mr. Vandermeer." Catherine offered her hand, which he kissed with theatrical precision, his lips barely brushing her glove. "Your reputation for hospitality precedes you, though I must say the reality exceeds even the most extravagant rumors. I've heard this mansion described as the finest private residence between New York and Boston, and I'm inclined to believe it. I believe our homes should reflect our aspirations," Vandermeer said, his eyes never leaving hers, studying her with an intensity that felt almost predatory. "Tell me, Mrs. Ashford, what are your aspirations? What do you dream about in the small hours of the morning when sleep won't come and the world is quiet?" The question was too intimate for a casual social gathering, too probing. Catherine felt Margaret stiffen beside her, but she'd been asked worse questions and survived them. "To survive the winter without pneumonia," she replied lightly, earning a laugh from the nearby guests. "And perhaps to see my garden bloom again in spring. Simple pleasures, Mr. Vandermeer. I'm afraid I lack your grand vision. Survival is such a limited goal," he said, still watching her with those cold grey eyes. "I prefer to aim higher. Dominance, perhaps, or control. The ability to shape the world rather than simply endure it." Before Catherine could respond, a portly man in an ill-fitting evening coat interrupted, clapping Vandermeer on the shoulder with the familiarity of long acquaintance or significant financial investment. "Vandermeer, you old devil. I hear your railway expansion into the Western Territories is proceeding ahead of schedule. The transcontinental connection, isn't that what you're calling it?" Vandermeer's smile shifted, becoming warmer, more genuine. "Senator Pemberton, I'm pleased to report that we've laid track through 3 mountain passes that engineers said were impossible to cross. We'll be connecting Denver to Salt Lake City by spring, God willing and weather permitting." Catherine drifted away from the conversation as it turned to technical details of railway construction, finding herself a glass of champagne from a passing tray. She sipped it slowly, the bubbles tickling her nose, and surveyed the room with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to read gatherings the way scholars read books. There in the corner was Harrison Blackwell, the shipping magnate Margaret had mentioned. He was a thick-bodied man with mutton-chop whiskers gone grey and small, mean eyes that darted constantly, as if searching for threats or opportunities. He stood with a group of younger men who hung on his every word, laughing too loud at jokes that probably weren't funny, competing for his attention like dogs begging for scraps. Near the window stood a couple Catherine recognized, Thomas and Eleanor Caldwell, old money trying desperately to maintain relevance in a world that increasingly valued innovation over pedigree. Thomas's family fortune came from textile mills established before the Revolution, but foreign competition was eating into their profits year after year. Eleanor's pearls were real, but the diamonds in her ears were paste, a detail most people wouldn't notice but Catherine had learned to spot. And everywhere, weaving between the guests with the efficiency of worker ants, were Vandermeer's servants. Too many of them, Catherine realized. Far more than were strictly necessary for a gathering of this size. And they moved with a strange uniformity, their eyes constantly scanning, watching, observing. The evening progressed with the predictable rhythm of high society affairs. Champagne flowed like the rain outside, an endless river of French bubbles that loosened tongues and lowered inhibitions. Servants glided through the crowds with silver trays of oysters on ice, foie gras on crackers, caviar from the Caspian Sea, and delicacies Catherine couldn't identify, but ate anyway. She made conversation with senators' wives who pretended to care about charity work, while mentally calculating the social advantage of each interaction. She laughed at bankers' jokes that weren't funny, but served as loyalty tests. She complimented women on jewelry she knew they couldn't afford, and listened to men brag about business deals she suspected were illegal. And all the while, she kept one eye on Harrison Blackwell, trying to determine the best approach. She needed information about his shipping contracts, specifically about a certain cargo that had arrived at the Providence docks 3 weeks ago and immediately disappeared into warehouses owned by shell companies. Margaret had heard rumors, whispers of irregularities, of manifests that didn't match the actual contents of crates. If Catherine could confirm those rumors, she could use that information to secure Blackwell's cooperation in another matter entirely, a property dispute involving a widow who'd hired Catherine to help protect her late husband's estate from predatory creditors. "Dance with me." Catherine turned to find a young man at her elbow. He couldn't have been more than 25, with sandy hair that refused to lie flat despite obvious applications of pomade, and earnest blue eyes that seemed almost childlike in this den of practiced deceit. He had the kind of face that belonged in a Sunday school class, not a Providence Society gathering. "I don't believe we've been introduced," Catherine said, studying him with the wariness of someone who'd learned that earnest faces could hide calculating minds. "Thomas Whitfield," he said, offering his arm with a slight bow that was charmingly old-fashioned. "My father owns the Whitfield Steel Works. I've been trying to get up the courage to approach you all evening. The truth is, I've wanted to speak with you for quite some time, but I could never quite find the right moment or the right words." Intrigued, despite herself, Catherine accepted his arm and allowed him to lead her to the dance floor, where couples swirled to a waltz the quartet was playing with mechanical precision. Thomas proved to be an adequate dancer, but an enthusiastic one, his steps perhaps a bit too large, his turns a bit too energetic. As they moved across the polished floor, Catherine noticed something odd. Every few moments Thomas would glance toward the walls, his expression troubled, his jaw tightening as if he was fighting some internal battle. "You seem distracted, Mr. Whitfield," Catherine said, raising her voice slightly to be heard over the music. "I apologize," he said quickly, his face flushing. "It's just this house. Don't you find it strange? Don't you feel like something is fundamentally wrong here, even if you can't quite put your finger on what it is?" "Strange how?" Thomas lowered his voice, leaning closer as they turned. His breath smelled of peppermint and nervousness. "The mirrors. Look at them. Really look. Don't just glance, actually study them." Catherine turned her attention to the enormous gilt mirrors that lined the salon walls. At first glance they appeared normal. Expensive, certainly. Venetian glass set in elaborate frames carved with cherubs and grapevines and classical motifs. But as she studied them more closely during the next turn, she noticed something peculiar. The reflections were slightly off, as if the glass was thicker than it should be. The images were fractionally delayed, a heartbeat behind the actual movements they reflected. And in the candlelight, when the angle was just right, she could swear she saw movement behind the surface. Shadows that didn't match any guest in the room, shapes that shouldn't exist in a simple reflection. "You're imagining things," she said, but her pulse quickened. Her instincts, honed by months of navigating dangerous social waters, told her that Thomas was right. Something was wrong here. "Am I?" Thomas's voice dropped even lower, becoming barely a whisper. 3 weeks ago I attended a dinner party here. A small gathering, maybe 20 people. I had too much wine, more than I should have, and I wandered off looking for the water closet. I got lost in the east wing. The corridors here don't make sense, Mrs. Ashford. They twist and turn in ways that don't match the mansion's exterior dimensions, and the doors there. Mrs. Ashford, they don't lead to normal rooms. Catherine's mouth went dry. What do you mean? I found a corridor that ran parallel to the main hallway, narrow, barely wide enough for a man to stand. And it had openings, small gaps in the wall covered with metal grating. You could see through them into the bedrooms, into the private spaces where guests were staying. That's absurd. Is it? Last week, my father's business rival, a man named Cornelius Hatch, somehow knew about a private conversation my father had during a card game. A conversation about a pending railway contract, about which companies my father intended to support and which he intended to undermine. The conversation took place in one of Vandermeer's smoking rooms late at night, with no one else present. My father checked. He made absolutely certain they were alone. And yet, 3 days later, Hatch confronted him with exact quotes from that conversation. Exact words, Mrs. Ashford. Not paraphrases or educated guesses. Verbatim quotations. The waltz ended. Catherine stepped back, her mind racing through implications and possibilities. If what Thomas was suggesting was true, if Vandermeer had actually built his mansion as some kind of elaborate listening device, then the ramifications were staggering. Every conversation held here, every private moment, every secret shared in what people assumed was safety, all of it could be compromised. All of it could be weaponized. "Why are you telling me this?" Catherine asked, studying Thomas's face for signs of deception or manipulation. "Because I've heard things about you," Thomas said, meeting her eyes with that earnest gaze that seemed too innocent to be fake. "They say you're clever, that you survived your husband's scandal by being 3 steps ahead of everyone else, that you turned tragedy into advantage through sheer force of will and intelligence. If something is wrong here, if Vandermeer is using this house for something sinister, someone needs to expose it. Someone brave enough to look. Someone smart enough to survive. I think you might be that person." Before Catherine could respond, a commotion erupted near the entrance hall. Raised voices, a woman's scream quickly muffled. The music stuttered to a halt. The conversations died like candle flames in a sudden wind. Every eye in the mansion turned toward the source of the disturbance. A woman had collapsed near the grand staircase, her champagne glass shattering on the marble floor in a spray of crystal shards and golden liquid. She was young, maybe 22, wearing a pink gown that spread around her like petals. Her face was pale as milk, her eyes rolled back to show the whites. 2 servants rushed to her side, but not before Catherine noticed something. The woman's lips were blue. Not just pale from shock, but actually blue, the color of suffocation or poison. People surged forward, voices rising in alarm and concern. In the confusion, Catherine noticed Edgar Vandermeer slip out of the salon through a side door, moving with the quiet purpose of someone who didn't want to be observed. She made a decision. Perhaps not a wise one, but the kind of decision that had kept her alive and relatively prosperous in a world designed to destroy widows and other inconvenient women. She followed. The corridor beyond the salon was dimly lit. The gas lamps turned low to conserve fuel, or perhaps to maintain atmosphere. The walls here were different from the public spaces, less ornate, more functional. Service corridors, Catherine realized. The passages servants used to move through the mansion without disturbing their betters. Catherine moved quickly but quietly, her years of navigating society's treacherous waters having taught her how to be both present and invisible. She'd learned to walk in a way that made minimal noise, to breathe shallowly so her presence wouldn't disturb the air, to exist as a ghost when necessary. Ahead of her, Vandermeer moved with purpose, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor, confident that no one would dare follow him into his private domain. He turned a corner, then another, leading deeper into the mansion's labyrinthine interior. Catherine counted her turns, trying to maintain her mental map of the house's layout, but she quickly became disoriented. The corridors here didn't follow logical patterns. They curved when they should have been straight, intersected at odd angles, created spaces that shouldn't exist within the mansion's footprint. Catherine stopped at a T-junction, uncertain which way Vandermeer had gone. She could hear nothing but her own heartbeat, thundering so loud she was certain anyone within 50 feet could hear it. She chose left, following some instinct she couldn't articulate, and found herself in a gallery hung with portraits of men in outdated fashions. Powdered wigs and knee breeches, the style of the previous century. The painted eyes seemed to follow her as she passed. The air here felt different. Colder, despite the November chill being uniform throughout the mansion. The sounds of the party had faded to a distant murmur, as if the house itself was swallowing the noise, digesting it, transforming it into silence. She was about to turn back, to abandon this fool's errand, and return to the party before her absence was noted, when she heard voices. They came from behind the wall to her right, muffled but distinct enough to make out words. "The senator is wavering on the railway bill." That was Vandermeer's voice, no question. His support is crucial. Without it, the transcontinental connection dies in committee. Then we'll need to persuade him. A woman's voice, cultured but hard. Educated accent, probably Boston or New York. The kind of voice that came from expensive boarding schools and European finishing tours. "I have what we need," his letter to the actress. The one where he promised to leave his wife. Where he detailed his plans for divorce and remarriage. Quite touching, really. He has a way with words, our senator. Very poetic. Very incriminating. Excellent. And what about Blackwell? His shipping contracts are crucial to our operations. Blackwell is a fool who thinks his contracts protect him. He doesn't know I have records of every bribe he paid to secure them. Names, dates, amounts. Everything documented and notarized. If he ever becomes troublesome, I can destroy him with a single letter to the newspapers. Catherine's blood ran cold. She'd suspected Vandermeer was ruthless, that he used information as currency, but this was different. This was systematic. Industrial. He wasn't just gathering gossip to trade at parties. He was building an arsenal of secrets, weapons to be deployed against anyone who opposed him. This wasn't social maneuvering, this was warfare. She needed to find the source of these voices. Catherine ran her hands along the wall, searching for a seam, a hidden door, anything that might explain how sound was traveling through solid construction. Her fingers found a slight indentation in the carved molding, a place where the wood didn't quite meet the wallpaper. She pressed, and a section of the wall swung inward with a soft click that sounded deafening in the silence. The passage beyond was narrow, just as Thomas had described. The walls were bare wood, rough and unfinished, the kind of construction that never saw daylight or public eyes. A single gas lamp burned at intervals, casting dancing shadows that made the passage seem to twist and writhe like something alive. Catherine could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears as she moved forward, one hand trailing along the wall for balance. Openings appeared in the wall at regular intervals, small slots covered with metal grating, the kind used in heating ducts. Catherine peered through one and found herself looking into a bedroom. She could see the four-poster bed, the vanity with its array of perfume bottles and cosmetics, the wardrobe with its door slightly ajar. Another opening revealed a study, its desk covered with papers weighted down by a brass paperweight. A third showed a bathroom, the copper tub gleaming in the lamplight, still steaming from recent use. Every room, every corner. The entire mansion was designed to be observed, to have no truly private spaces, to render its inhabitants as transparent as the windows they looked through. Catherine heard footsteps approaching from ahead and quickly pressed herself against the wall, making herself as small and still as possible. A figure passed by the opening she'd entered through, silhouetted against the light from the gallery. She held her breath until her lungs burned. praying the shadows would hide her, praying that whoever was moving through these passages was too focused on their own mission to notice an intruder. The footsteps faded. Catherine exhaled slowly, her breath misting in the cold air. She continued forward, the passage twisting and turning, following the mansion's perimeter like a parasite following a body's circulatory system. She passed more viewing slots, each offering a window into the private spaces of Vandermeer's guests. Through one, she saw a couple arguing in hushed, angry whispers. The man's face was red with barely contained rage. The woman's eyes glittered with tears she refused to shed. Through another, she saw a man counting money from a leather satchel, his fingers moving with practiced speed as he sorted bills into neat stacks. Through a third, she saw a woman reading a letter, her expression shifting from hope to despair as her eyes traveled down the page. All of it watched, all of it recorded, if not on paper, then in the mind of whoever traveled these passages. All of it weaponized, transformed from private moments into potential instruments of control. The corridor ended at a heavy wooden door, reinforced with iron bands that spoke of serious security measures. Catherine tried the handle. Locked, naturally. But through the gap at the bottom, she could see light. And she could hear voices again, clearer now, multiple speakers in animated conversation. Congressman Riley will vote against the labor bill if we threaten to expose his gambling debts. He owes $17,000 to various establishments, some of them quite unsavory. And Senator Morrison? His opposition could be problematic. His daughter's indiscretion at the boarding school in Connecticut. We have testimony from 3 witnesses who saw her with the stable boy. In her condition, marriage will be urgent. The scandal would destroy Morrison's chances for re-election. What about the Caldwell textile situation? Thomas Caldwell is on the verge of bankruptcy. He's been hiding it well, but our informants tell us he's 3 months behind on payments to his suppliers. One word to his creditors and they'll force him into liquidation. His mills will sell at auction for pennies on the dollar. Catherine's hands trembled. She needed to get out of these passages, back to the party, and then out of this cursed house entirely. She needed to tell someone what she'd discovered. But who? The police? Half of them were probably in Vandermeer's files. The newspapers? The editors depended on Vandermeer's advertising revenue and political connections. She turned to retrace her steps and found her path blocked. Edgar Vandermeer stood in the narrow corridor, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Behind him, blocking any hope of retreat, stood 2 of his footmen. Large men with the dead eyes of people who'd seen too much and felt too little. "Mrs. Ashford," Vandermeer said quietly, his voice carrying an almost sad quality. "I had hoped you would have better sense than to go exploring. I really did. You seemed like a woman who understood the value of discretion." Catherine's mind raced through options, calculating odds, searching for leverage. "I got lost looking for the powder room. In a secret passage behind the walls." Vandermeer stepped closer, and Catherine could smell his cologne, expensive and cloying. "Please don't insult either of our intelligence. We're both too clever for such transparent lies." "What is this place?" "Insurance," Vandermeer said, his voice matter-of-fact, as if he was discussing portfolio diversification or crop futures. "In business, Mrs. Ashford, information is the only currency that never devalues. Stocks crash, banks fail, fortunes evaporate overnight. But secrets? Secrets retain their worth indefinitely. These passages allow me to gather that currency, to see what people really are when they think no one is watching, to hear what they say when they believe their words are private." "You're blackmailing them, all of them." "Blackmail is such an ugly word, don't you think? I prefer to think of it as strategic leverage. Providence is built on influence, Mrs. Ashford. Fortunes rise and fall based on who knows what about whom. Political careers hinge on carefully managed reputations. Social standing depends on maintaining certain appearances. I simply ensured I would always know more than anyone else. that I would always have the leverage necessary to protect my interests and advance my goals. The people at your party tonight, they're all being watched. Right now? Of course. As we speak, my associates are cataloging every conversation, every gesture, every secret whispered in what they believe are secure corners. By tomorrow morning, I'll have enough material to influence 12 votes in the state legislature, secure 3 business contracts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and destroy at least 2 reputations completely. It's quite efficient, really. Catherine's stomach turned. You're a monster. I'm a pragmatist who understands how the world actually works, rather than how people pretend it works. And you, Mrs. Ashford, are now part of a very exclusive group. You know my secret, which means you've become a liability, a problem that requires solution. The temperature in the passage seemed to drop 20 degrees. Catherine's eyes darted past Vandermeer, calculating if she could slip past him, run back the way she'd come, somehow reach the party and scream for help. Don't be foolish, Vandermeer said, reading her intention with the ease of someone who'd spent years studying human behavior. There are 6 exits from these passages, and I have men stationed at each one. You cannot escape. The house won't let you. But I'm not an unreasonable man. Despite what you think of me, despite the harsh words you just used, I'm willing to offer you a choice. More generosity than I've shown others in your position, I might add. What choice? Join me. Use that clever mind of yours, that talent for observation and deduction, to help me expand this operation. You have access to circles I cannot penetrate. The women's charity organizations, the church committees, the afternoon tea gatherings where real power in this city is negotiated behind china cups and polite conversation. Help me put ears in those rooms, and I'll make you wealthy beyond your current imagination. You'll never have to worry about money again, never have to debase yourself gathering scraps of gossip to sell to the highest bidder. You'll have real power, Mrs. Ashford, the kind that lasts. And if I refuse? Vandermeer's smile was colder than the November rain hammering against the mansion's windows. Then I'm afraid you'll have to join the other guests who discovered my secret. They're buried in the cellar, beneath the wine storage. The foundation is quite deep, you see. We dug it extra deep when we built the mansion. Very convenient for disposal. No one will ever find them. And no one will ever find you. Catherine's blood turned to ice. You've killed people. Multiple people. Only those who gave me no choice. Only those who threatened to expose what I've built here. The newspaper editor who started asking questions about how I seemed to know things I shouldn't. The private investigator hired by a suspicious wife whose husband had confided the wrong secrets in my guest bedroom. A former business partner who developed an inconvenient conscience after learning about my methods. They're all quite comfortable now, quite beyond caring about such earthly concerns. He spoke of murder the way other men spoke of firing incompetent employees. Casual, necessary, unpleasant, but ultimately justified by the bottom line. You seem like a reasonable woman, Mrs. Ashford. Surely you can see the wisdom in cooperation over resistance. You've already proven yourself adaptable. You survived your husband's scandal through intelligence and determination. You've built a new life from the ashes of the old one. This is simply the next adaptation, the next evolution. She could scream. But would anyone hear her through these thick walls, through the layers of insulation and careful construction designed specifically to muffle sound? Would anyone come? Or would Vandermeer simply claim she'd taken ill, had to leave early, met with some unfortunate accident on the fog-shrouded streets of Providence? I need time to think, Catherine said, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. Of course, a reasonable request. Take until midnight. I'll have someone escort you to the Blue Room. It's quite comfortable. Locked, naturally, for your own protection. We wouldn't want you to have any more unfortunate wanderings. When the clock strikes 12, I'll return for your answer. Choose wisely, Mrs. Ashford. Your life depends on it, quite literally. One of the footmen grabbed her arm with professional efficiency, his grip just tight enough to hurt without leaving visible bruises. They led her down the passage, through a concealed door hidden behind a full-length mirror, and up a servant's staircase that smelled of lye soap and boiled cabbage. The mansion's secret skeleton, the infrastructure that supported its gleaming facade. The blue room lived up to its name. Every surface was covered in varying shades of blue, from the sapphire velvet curtains to the midnight silk bedspread to the powder blue wallpaper, decorated with delicate silver filigree. A fire crackled in the marble fireplace, but it did nothing to warm the chill in Catherine's bones. This wasn't cold from temperature. This was the cold of absolute terror. The footman left without a word. She heard the lock click, solid and final. The windows, when she checked them, were sealed shut, their handles removed. Someone had thought of everything. Someone had planned for this contingency. Catherine paced the room, her mind spinning through scenarios like a gambler shuffling cards. She could agree to Vandermeer's proposal, pretend to cooperate, then find a way to expose him later. But he was clearly too smart for such an obvious ploy. He'd test her loyalty, probably by having her gather information that would implicate her in his schemes. Once she was compromised, once her hands were dirty, she'd never be able to turn on him without destroying herself. She could try to escape, but how? The door was locked solid. The windows were sealed. Even if she managed to break free, Vandermeer had men throughout the mansion. She'd never make it to the street, and if she did, who would believe her? A widow with a scandalous past accusing one of Providence's most prominent citizens of murder and espionage. They'd think she'd lost her mind. Or she could refuse his offer and accept whatever fate he'd planned for those who defied him. Join the bodies in the cellar, become another disappeared person, another unsolved mystery. None of the options ended well. As the hours crept toward midnight, Catherine studied every inch of the blue room, searching for something, anything that might help her. She examined the fireplace, wondering if the chimney might offer escape, but it was too narrow and filled with smoke. She checked the floorboards, hoping for a loose one that might hide something useful, but they were solid and well-maintained. She even examined the furniture, looking for anything that might be weaponized, but everything was too heavy or too delicate to be of use. The clock on the mantel showed 11:30. 30 minutes until Vandermeer returned. 30 minutes to decide between death and damnation. That's when she noticed something odd about the mirror above the vanity. It was slightly askew, hanging at an angle that didn't match the room's otherwise perfect symmetry. Catherine approached it slowly, studying its reflection, and then she saw it. A faint seam in the wall behind the mirror. Another hidden door. Her heart racing, Catherine carefully lifted the mirror from its hooks and set it aside. The seam became more visible. She pressed on it, and a section of wall swung inward, revealing another of those narrow passages. Catherine didn't hesitate. She slipped into the darkness. This passage was different from the one she'd been caught in earlier. Rougher, less maintained. Cobwebs stretched across the ceiling. Dust lay thick on the floor. This wasn't part of Vandermeer's regular surveillance network. This was something older, probably original to the house's construction. She moved forward, guided only by faint light, filtering through cracks in the walls. The passage twisted and descended, taking her down into the mansion's lower levels. She passed openings that showed the kitchen, where servants cleaned up from the party. She passed slots that revealed wine cellars, storage rooms, coal bins, and then she found the door. Heavy wood, reinforced with iron, exactly like the one she'd seen in the surveillance passages, but this one was slightly ajar. Catherine pushed it open and immediately wished she hadn't. The chamber beyond was larger than she'd expected, carved out of the bedrock beneath the mansion. Gas lamps flickered along the walls, casting dancing shadows across the horror laid out before her. Bodies. Not 3, as Vandermeer had said. At least a dozen, maybe more, arranged in neat rows along one wall. Some were wrapped in canvas, others in simple wooden boxes. The smell was overpowering despite the lime scattered across the floor. Death and decay and the sweet, sickly odor of bodies returning to the earth. But that wasn't the worst of it. Along the opposite wall was a desk covered with papers, files stacked in careful organization. Catherine recognized names on the folders. Senator Morrison, Congressman Riley, Harrison Blackwell, the Caldwells. Names she recognized from the party upstairs, from Providence Society, from newspaper headlines. And behind the desk, working by lamplight, was someone Catherine recognized. Margaret Sinclair, her supposed friend, sat examining documents with the focused attention of a scholar studying sacred texts. Margaret looked up, saw Catherine, and sighed. "Well," Margaret said, setting down her papers. "This is unfortunate." Catherine's world tilted sideways. "You work for him. You brought me here." "I work with him, actually. There's a distinction. Edgar provides the infrastructure. I provide the access. Between us, we've created something quite remarkable. A network of information that spans this entire city. Every secret, every scandal, every weakness. All catalogued, all available for use. You invited me to this party knowing what would happen. I invited you because Edgar wanted to test you. To see if you'd notice the inconsistencies, if you'd go looking for answers. He has a talent for identifying people who might be useful to our operation. You've survived where others failed, Catherine. You've adapted to changing circumstances. Those are valuable traits. So this was all a setup. Thomas Whitfield, the collapsed woman, everything. Thomas is genuine, poor fool. He actually did stumble onto the passages, and he's been suspicious ever since. We've been monitoring him to see if he'll become a problem. The woman who collapsed had a weak heart. We knew the excitement might trigger an episode. Unfortunate, but useful as a distraction. Catherine's mind reeled. How many people are involved in this? In Providence, perhaps 24 who know the full scope. Many more who provide pieces of information without understanding the larger picture. Servants who listen, society ladies who share gossip, businessmen who pass along financial intelligence. It's a beautiful system, really. Everyone contributes, everyone benefits, or at least everyone who cooperates benefits. And those who don't cooperate end up down here. Only when necessary. Edgar doesn't enjoy killing, contrary to what you might think. It's simply a cost of doing business, like paying taxes or maintaining equipment. Footsteps echoed in the passage behind Catherine. Edgar Vandermeer emerged from the shadows, followed by 2 of his footmen. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, checking his pocket watch. "You're early, and you found our archive. I must say I'm impressed. Most people trapped in the Blue Room never think to check behind the mirror. You truly are remarkable." "You planned this," Catherine said, her voice hollow. "All of it. I gave you a choice. The room, the time, the pressure, all designed to help you make the correct decision. But I also gave you tools, hints, opportunities to demonstrate your resourcefulness. The mirror, the passage, even Margaret's presence here. All of it a test. What kind of monster are you?" "The successful kind," Vandermeer replied. "The kind who understands that power comes not from what you own, but from what you know. Now, Mrs. Ashford, you've seen everything. You understand the scope of what we've built. So I'll ask you one final time. Will you join us or will you join them?" He gestured toward the bodies. Catherine looked at Margaret, who watched her with cool appraisal. She looked at Vandermeer, who waited with patient certainty. She looked at the files, the records of destruction, the evidence of systematic evil. And then she looked at the bodies. Human beings reduced to problems, to complications, to waste products of an efficient system. "I need to know something first," Catherine said, her voice steadier than she felt. "The woman who collapsed tonight, did you poison her?" Vandermeer's expression didn't change. "Yes. She was the sister of a newspaper editor who was getting too curious. Her death will serve as a warning to him. He'll understand the message." So you're not just blackmailing people, you're killing them, actively, continuously, when necessary. It's all quite logical if you think about it dispassionately. Catherine nodded slowly, as if considering this, as if weighing the logic of mass murder against the benefits of survival. She took a step forward, closing the distance between herself and Vandermeer. "I have one more question," she said. "Yes? How many people know about this room, this specific chamber?" Vandermeer glanced at Margaret. "Just the three of us in this room. Why?" "Because you made a mistake," Catherine said, and screamed. She screamed with every ounce of air in her lungs, a sound of pure terror that echoed through the passages and up through the mansion's infrastructure. The thick walls that were designed to muffle sound from the surveillance passages didn't extend down here. Down here, in the mansion's bedrock, sound traveled differently. Vandermeer lunged for her, but Catherine was already moving, dodging past him toward the passage. One of the footmen grabbed her arm, but she twisted, using the momentum to swing around and drive her elbow into his throat. He released her with a choked gasp. She ran. Back through the passage, up the incline, her screams continuing, echoing, amplifying. She had no plan beyond making noise, beyond drawing attention, beyond ensuring that whatever happened next would not happen in quiet secrecy. She burst out of the passage into the kitchen, where servants froze in shock. She kept screaming, kept running, through the servants' corridor and into the main hallway. Behind her, she heard Vandermeer shouting orders, heard footsteps pounding in pursuit. The grand salon doors were still open, the party winding down but not yet over. Catherine ran through them, still screaming, blood on her dress from where she'd torn her arm on a rough edge of the passage, her hair wild, her face pale as death. The remaining guests stared in shock. Thomas Whitfield was there, his face going white as he recognized her distress. Harrison Blackwell stood near the window, his expression shifting from surprise to calculation. "He's a murderer," Catherine screamed. "Vandermeer kills people. There are bodies in the cellar. He watches everyone, spies on everything. The mansion is full of hidden passages." Vandermeer appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of concern. "Mrs. Ashford has taken ill. The excitement, the champagne. She's clearly not herself. We need to get her somewhere quiet where she can rest." "Liar." Catherine lunged toward the nearest guest, a senator she vaguely recognized. "He has files on all of you, every secret, every weakness. He's blackmailing the entire city." "She's hysterical," Margaret said, appearing behind Vandermeer with perfect timing. "Poor dear. She's never quite recovered from her husband's suicide. The strain has been too much." Catherine felt the room turning against her, saw the calculation in people's eyes, saw them weighing her credibility against Vandermeer's reputation, saw them choosing comfort over truth. And then Thomas Whitfield stepped forward. "She's telling the truth," he said, his voice carrying despite his youth. "I've seen the passages. 3 weeks ago I told her about them. The mansion is built to spy on everyone who visits." "Mr. Whitfield has been drinking," Vandermeer said smoothly. "Both of them are clearly not themselves." "Then let's search the house," Thomas said. "Right now, if Mrs. Ashford is lying, if I'm lying, it will be obvious. But if we're telling the truth, everyone in this room deserves to know." For a moment, the balance teetered. Catherine could see Vandermeer calculating, weighing his options. He could try to deny everything, could attempt to remove both her and Thomas before they did more damage. But there were too many witnesses now, too many people who'd heard the accusations. Harrison Blackwell spoke up, his voice gruff. "I'd like to see these passages, if they exist." "As would I," said another voice. Senator Morrison stepped forward. "If there's even a chance that my private conversations have been compromised, I need to know." Vandermeer's expression hardened. In that moment, Catherine saw him make his decision. saw him choose to cut his losses rather than fight a battle he might not win. "Very well," he said coldly. "If you insist on searching my home based on the ravings of a disturbed woman and a drunk boy, I can hardly stop you, though I'll remember this insult." They found the passages within minutes, the mirror slots, the hidden doors, the surveillance network that ran throughout the mansion like veins through a body. They found Vandermeer's office with its files, its carefully documented secrets. They found the recordings of conversations, the transcribed confessions, the weapons he'd built from other people's weaknesses. And in the cellar, wrapped in canvas and lime, they found the bodies. 13 of them. Newspaper editors, private investigators, business rivals, a former servant who'd asked too many questions. All murdered. All hidden beneath the foundation of Providence's most magnificent mansion. The police were summoned. Captain Morrison arrived with a dozen officers, his face grey as he realized his own daughter's scandal was documented in Vandermeer's files. The mansion was sealed. Guests were detained for questioning. Evidence was collected in box after box, a paper trail of corruption and murder that stretched back years. Edgar Vandermeer was arrested in his own grand salon, surrounded by the very people he'd spent years controlling. He didn't resist, didn't try to run, just stood there with that cold smile, watching his empire crumble with the detachment of a man observing someone else's tragedy. Margaret Sinclair tried to slip away in the confusion, but Thomas Whitfield stopped her, holding her until the police could take her into custody. Her expression never changed. Even in defeat, she maintained that cool, calculating demeanor. The trial lasted 6 weeks and dominated every newspaper in New England. Witnesses testified to the secrets Vandermeer had collected, the pressure he'd applied, the lives he'd destroyed. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. Edgar Vandermeer was hanged on a grey morning in March. The rain falling like the tears Providence itself should have shed, but didn't. Margaret Sinclair received a life sentence, shipped to a women's prison in Maine, where she would spend her remaining years in solitary contemplation of the system she'd helped build. The mansion on Benefit Street was seized by the state and eventually sold at auction, but no one wanted to live in it. Stories spread about what had happened there, about the bodies in the cellar and the eyes in the walls. It changed hands several times, each owner trying and failing to erase its dark history. Some tried to convert it into apartments. The tenants complained of sounds in the walls, of feeling watched, of secrets whispered in the night. Others attempted to make it a hotel, but guests refused to stay more than one night, disturbed by the building's oppressive atmosphere. Eventually, the mansion was abandoned entirely. The city condemned it as structurally unsound, though everyone knew the structure was solid. What was unsound was its soul, if buildings could be said to have souls. It stood empty for years, slowly succumbing to weather and neglect, its windows broken, its grand staircase rotting, its surveillance passages gradually collapsing. Catherine Ashford left Providence a month after the trial ended. She moved to Boston, where she opened an office under a different name. She helped women escape dangerous marriages, gathered evidence against corrupt businessmen, used the skills she'd learned from Vandermeer to fight the kind of evil he'd embodied. She never married again, never returned to Providence, never spoke of that November night except in her private journals, which she burned before her death at age 72. Thomas Whitfield inherited his father's steel company and used his fortune to support reform movements, labor rights, and anti-corruption campaigns. He married a schoolteacher and had 4 children. But he never attended another society gathering, never accepted another dinner invitation. Spent his evenings at home, where the walls were thin and ordinary and held no secrets. The survivors of Vandermeer's files tried to rebuild their reputations, but the stain never quite washed away. Senator Morrison lost his re-election bid. Harrison Blackwell's shipping company collapsed under the weight of investigations into his government contracts. The Caldwell textiles business, went bankrupt. One by one, the people who danced in Vandermeer's grand salon discovered that their secrets, once exposed, couldn't be hidden again. Providence itself changed. The old certainties of the Gilded Age began to crumble. The gap between rich and poor became impossible to ignore. Reform movements gained strength. The casual corruption that had seemed normal began to look criminal. But the mansion remained, a monument to what happened when power went unchecked, when information became weaponized, when human beings were reduced to assets and liabilities in some vast, inhuman calculation. Years later, on foggy November nights when the rain fell like it had that fatal evening, people swore they could still hear sounds from the abandoned mansion. Footsteps in empty corridors, whispers behind walls, the click of locks turning in rooms no one entered. The rustle of papers being filed, secrets being catalogued, lives being measured and found wanting. But Catherine Ashford knew better than to believe in ghosts. She'd learned, in that mansion on Benefit Street, that the real horror wasn't what might haunt a building after evil had departed. The real horror was what happened when evil was present, when the walls had eyes, when every word was recorded, when privacy itself became a fiction. Because in Edgar Vandermeer's house, nothing was ever safe, nothing was ever private, and the walls were always listening. The mansion stood for another 20 years before the city finally ordered its demolition. The work took 6 months. Workers reported strange things. Tools that went missing and reappeared in different locations. Sounds that came from parts of the building they'd already torn down. A sense of being watched even in rooms with no walls left to watch from. When they finally reached the foundation, they found more bodies. Not in the cellar where Vandermeer had stored his victims, but buried deeper, in the bedrock itself. Old bodies from before Vandermeer's time. Apparently, he hadn't been the first to build his fortune on buried secrets. The land itself seemed cursed, soaked in the sins of men who'd mistaken power for virtue and control for safety. They filled in the foundation, paved over the site, built a small park with benches and a fountain. Today, it's a pleasant green space where mothers bring children to play and old men sit to feed pigeons. Few visitors know what once stood there. Fewer still know what happened in its halls. But on certain November evenings, when the fog rolls in from the bay and the rain begins to fall, some people claim they can still feel it. The weight of being watched. The sense that somewhere, somehow, the walls are still listening, and perhaps they're right. Because secrets don't die when the people who kept them die. They linger in the air, soaked into the ground, embedded in the very stones. They wait in the darkness, patient as death, ready to be discovered by the next person who believes that knowledge is power, that information is currency, that other people's weaknesses are weapons to be hoarded and deployed. The mansion is gone. Edgar Vandermeer is dead. Margaret Sinclair rotted in prison. But the temptation they embodied, the dark allure of knowing everyone else's secrets while keeping your own hidden, that temptation remains. It whispers in corridors of power. It lurks in databases and file cabinets. It hides behind mirrors and inside walls, waiting for someone else to build its temple, to worship at its altar, to sacrifice truth and privacy and human dignity on its blood-stained stone. Catherine Ashford understood this. In her final journal entry, written the night before she burned all the others, she wrote, "We like to think evil is something external, something that comes from monsters like Vandermeer. But the truth is simpler and more terrible. Evil is what happens when ordinary people decide that winning matters more than goodness, that success justifies sin, that the ends really do justify the means." Vandermeer built his mansion on that lie. But all of Providence lived in it, danced in it, drank its champagne, and pretended not to see what was obvious to anyone willing to look. We were complicit in our own surveillance. We traded our privacy for the promise of prosperity. And we only objected when the walls finally spoke aloud the secrets we'd allowed them to collect. The park where the mansion once stood is quiet tonight. The rain has stopped. Stars peek through breaking clouds. A mother pushes her child on a swing, the chains creaking in the still air. The child laughs, delighted by the sensation of flight. The mother smiles, grateful for this moment of simple joy. And beneath their feet, 6 feet down, where the foundation once stood, where bodies once rested, where secrets once accumulated like interest in a blood bank, the earth keeps its silence. Because some secrets are too heavy to speak aloud, some sins too deep to confess. And some houses, even when they've been torn down stone by stone and erased from the landscape, continue to cast shadows that no amount of sunlight can dispel. The mansion on Benefit Street is gone, but what it represented, what it embodied, what it taught us about the price of power and the cost of knowing too much, these lessons remain. They wait in the darkness between one breath and the next, one heartbeat and another, one secret and its inevitable exposure. They wait for us to forget that walls have ears, that privacy once lost can never truly be regained, that every system built on exploitation will eventually collapse under its own weight, and that somewhere, in some city, some ambitious soul is even now designing the next Vandermeer mansion, the next architecture of surveillance, the next temple to the dark god of information. Because we never really learn, do we? We just keep building the same prisons and calling them homes. Now, I don't have good news. I love to produce these videos, but create them. It takes me a lot of time, and the only way I have to continue is to reach 1,000 subscribers, because this way I start receiving from YouTube. If you like our stories, do not let this channel die. Sign up and share our videos, since I am grateful.